Imagine a world like this. Information is everywhere. Opinions are endless. Answers are instant. And yet, people are thinking less than ever. Have you noticed how certain everyone sounds now? No hesitation. No doubt. No questions. People no longer say, "I might be wrong." They say, "This is just how it is." As if the world has suddenly become simple, and complexity itself has become something to mock. It feels like progress, doesn't it? And yet, somewhere deep inside, something feels off. Because what is truly frightening is not ignorance, but the moment thinking stops, while you are convinced you already understand everything. You may not realize it, but we are living in an age where critical thinking is quietly disappearing. Not taken by force. Not banned by authority. But dissolved slowly by something far more subtle, and far more dangerous. A force you use every day, without questioning it. The content you see feels increasingly familiar. The opinions you hear feel increasingly comfortable. Algorithms decide what you might like. The crowd tells you what most people think. So you no longer need to think. You just need to choose a side. You no longer need to understand. You just need to share. You no longer need to judge. You just need to follow. And the most terrifying part, you will feel smarter than ever before. Nietzsche once warned of a particular danger: when a person mistakes the voice of the crowd for their own thoughts, they not only lose their freedom, they begin to enjoy the loss. Have you felt it too? The moment you repeat an opinion without truly knowing why you believe it, the moment you mock or attack someone you call stupid, without ever examining whether your own position is just as hollow. We like to think of stupidity as a personal flaw. But perhaps the truth is closer to this: stupidity is becoming a collective condition. Not a decline in intelligence, but a loss of patience for complexity, a loss of tolerance for disagreement, a loss of the ability to doubt oneself. When critical thinking leaves the stage, emotion takes over. Fear, anger, moral superiority, righteous pleasure, they replace thought as the engine of action. And have you, without realizing it, handed over the responsibility of thinking to someone else? If you feel uncomfortable right now, that is exactly where this question truly begins. Because what comes next is far more disturbing. If most people are becoming more foolish, how can you be certain you are not one of them? That is why we must go deeper. Psychological mechanisms, philosophical roots, and a silent mental decline. If you think the disappearance of critical thinking is simply because people are lazy, you are underestimating the depth of the problem. The real cause is not laziness, it is that the human psyche itself is being reshaped. Carl Jung once proposed an unsettling idea: when a person cannot face their own shadow, they outsource the burden of thinking to the outside world. And today, that outside world has never been larger, more aggressive, or more accommodating. You no longer need to ask, "Who am I?" Labels will tell you. You no longer need to judge what is right. Your side will decide for you. You no longer even need an opinion, emotion will speak on your behalf. Thus, thinking stops being a skill and becomes a liability. Because real thinking requires doubt. Doubt creates uncertainty. And uncertainty generates anxiety. Nietzsche understood this clearly: most people do not fear pain. What they truly fear is a world without fixed answers. So they crave simple explanations, clear enemies, obvious villains, absolute truths. Complexity is labeled weakness. Hesitation is mocked as incompetence. Reflection is mistaken for betrayal. In such an environment, critical thinking is not outlawed, it is humiliated, marginalized, and ridiculed as unnecessary. Schopenhauer observed a deep human impulse: people would rather follow than judge independently, because independent judgment demands responsibility. And the crowd always shares the blame. When you stand with the majority, even if you are wrong, you can still say, "At least I wasn't alone." This is the most subtle psychological engine of collective stupidity. It doesn't require you to abandon reason, only to stop using it. Modern society provides perfect conditions for this state. Information is fragmented. Thought is compressed into opinions. Opinions are reduced to positions. Positions are packaged as identities. You no longer think about an issue, you become a type of person. And once identity is involved, any question feels like an attack, any reflection feels like a threat. Jean-Paul Sartre once said something brutal: people are not trapped by truth, but by the ways they avoid it. Critical thinking is the easiest ability to avoid. Because it forces you to admit you might be wrong, you do not fully understand, and the world is far more ambiguous, complex, and uncontrollable than you wish. So the real question is not, why don't others think anymore? It is this: in a system that rewards conformity and punishes thought, how long can you keep thinking? If you are beginning to see that this is not a personal failure, but a transformation of our collective psyche, then you are standing at a dangerous, and crucial, edge. Because what you are about to discover next is this: when critical thinking disappears, it is never just thought that vanishes. How the loss of critical thinking quietly rewrites destiny. The truly dangerous thing is not stupidity itself. It is not realizing that you are becoming stupid. The disappearance of critical thinking does not arrive with an explosion. It doesn't feel like a catastrophe, and it doesn't require force to sustain it. It feels more like a slow blindness. You still see the world, but you can no longer tell fact from narrative. You still express opinions, but you're no longer sure whether those opinions are truly yours. You begin to notice your patience for complexity shrinking, your resistance to long-form thinking growing, your dependence on simple conclusions deepening. And the most disturbing part, you will justify it. There's no need to think so much. It won't change anything anyway. Everyone's like this. This is the clearest sign of cognitive decline. People build entire defense systems to protect themselves from thinking. From a neuroscientific perspective, the brain does not love truth. It loves efficiency. Critical thinking demands conflict, trade-offs, delayed judgment, all of which consume mental energy. When an environment constantly supplies ready-made conclusions, instant emotional rewards, and a system where choosing a side equals being right, the brain naturally chooses the path of least resistance. Over time, you are no longer choosing not to think, you are losing the capacity to think. Like a muscle never used, it doesn't scream or ache. It simply fails one day. On a personal level, this quietly reshapes your destiny. You become easier to manipulate emotionally, more driven by fear, more likely to mistake short-term comfort for long-term truth. You make decisions that feel reasonable, but are fundamentally acts of avoidance. You call stagnation, stability, numbness, maturity, and surrender, realism. On a societal level, this state multiplies. When enough people stop thinking, systems no longer need to be reasonable, only easy to understand. When enough people reject complexity, manipulation becomes effortless. Aldous Huxley warned us in Brave New World, the most effective control is not enforced through pain, but through comfort. Not by taking away your right to think, but by making you stop wanting to think. And so a society emerges that appears free. People speak endlessly, yet think rarely. They declare positions constantly, yet understand very little. This is the true consequence of collective stupidity. The world keeps moving, but its direction is no longer chosen by the conscious. If you feel a quiet unease, as if you are being carried by an invisible current, unable to say where it leads, that is not your failure. It is your remaining critical thinking sending a final signal. Because what comes next is no longer just a problem to analyze, but a choice: continue drifting downstream, or begin to rebel. When you relearn how to think, the world becomes real again. True rebellion is not raging against the world. It is choosing to think in an era that rewards intellectual surrender. That may sound insignificant, but it is exactly what the system fears most. Because a person who truly thinks is no longer easily provoked, no longer defined by labels, and no longer needs to be told which side to stand on. Nietzsche once said, "Independent thinkers are dangerous. Not because they are violent, but because they are unpredictable." The first step in breaking collective stupidity is not consuming more information, but rebuilding tolerance for complexity. You must retrain yourself to face questions without immediate answers, to sit with ambiguity, uncertainty, contradiction, to allow the state of, "I don't know yet," to exist. This alone is an act of psychological rebellion. Jung called this withdrawing from the collective consciousness. When you stop rushing to align with dominant narratives, stop categorizing everything as right or wrong, your awareness begins to turn inward. You no longer ask, "What do people think?" but instead, "Why do I think this?" That question is dangerous, because it leads you back to an inner world you have long neglected. The second step is just as uncomfortable: dissect the origin of your beliefs. You must ruthlessly ask, are these thoughts the result of reflection, or the byproduct of prolonged exposure? Do you hold certain opinions to feel a sense of belonging? Is your anger directed at targets chosen for you? This is a form of self-interrogation that borders on cruelty. But only through this stripping away will you discover the truth: many of your deep convictions were never truly yours. The third step, and the most counterintuitive one, is this: stop excessive expression, and start deep thinking. A collectivized society encourages constant expression, endless positioning, relentless output. Because expression creates the illusion of thought. But real thinking often happens in silence. Marcus Aurelius warned us, "You do not have to share every thought you have." When you reduce meaningless expression, you finally hear your own thinking rhythm. You notice how many opinions collapse in silence, how many emotions dissolve before being reinforced. This is not withdrawal. It is the reclamation of consciousness. Historically, those who truly understood life shared one thing in common: they spent long periods alone. Not out of contempt for others, but because clarity itself requires distance from the crowd. It is not romantic. It is often painful. But it is the price of sovereignty. When you begin to think independently, you may become less agreeable, less certain, but undeniably more real. And that is where rebellion truly begins. Now, we can finally face the truth you've been avoiding, yet have always known. Critical thinking was not stolen from you. It was voluntarily abandoned. Because real thinking has never been comfortable. It dissolves certainty, prevents easy alignment, and forces you to question the beliefs that once made you feel safe. Most people are not unintelligent. They are simply exhausted by uncertainty. Collective stupidity, then, is not a decline in intelligence, but a psychological compromise. Schopenhauer understood this well: human beings prefer the comfort of illusion to the burden of truth. When you hand over the responsibility of thinking to authorities, algorithms, or group consensus, you are not deceived, you are relieved. Relieved from doubt. Relieved from loneliness. Relieved from accountability. And the price is the gradual loss of sovereignty over reality. This is what makes collective stupidity so dangerous and so subtle: it feels easy. You no longer need to understand complexity. You no longer need to endure cognitive dissonance. You no longer need to face the possibility of being wrong. You only need to repeat, share, and agree. You gain emotional certainty but lose intellectual freedom. Here is the truly disruptive insight: critical thinking is not a skill, it is a capacity for endurance. The capacity to endure isolation. To endure misunderstanding. To endure unanswered questions. To stand alone at the edge of reality and still look clearly. When this capacity disappears, even the sharpest mind will choose the path of least resistance. This is not moral failure. It is human nature. Nietzsche saw this clearly: most people do not lack eyes, they simply refuse to open them. Because once you do, ignorance is no longer an option. You can no longer hide behind "everyone thinks this way" to justify your numbness. You must take responsibility for every judgment, every silence, every act of conformity. That is the true terror of awakening. So the real question is not, why is the world becoming stupid? The real question is, are you still willing to pay the price of clarity? Are you willing to think slower, speak less, and doubt more? Are you willing to remain silent in the noise, to accept uncertainty in an age addicted to certainty? If you are, then no matter how much the world deteriorates, you won't. Because critical thinking is not about defeating others, it is about not being swallowed by your time. This is not an intellectual battle. It is a way of being. And once you understand this, you no longer need to convince anyone. You only need to stop abandoning yourself.